You may be seated. The season of Christmas is full of imagery. You will see nestled amongst all these poinsettias up here, dioramas. All through the season of Advent, we had our families making dioramas of the stories from all of our Advent readings. And all of that is prequels to the manger scene, which you might have one at home. They always have shepherds and maybe wise men and animals, and Jesus is always in the manger, and that's kind of a snapshot of that scene. But if you think about having a baby around, Mary most certainly would have also picked up Jesus, right? He didn't just lay in the manger. You got to feed him. You got to change him. You got to make sure the animals aren't nibbling on him, right? Because he's laying where they eat. And so they would have to hold Jesus, because God did not come into the world as a mighty warrior, but as a tender and vulnerable child. And what do we do with things that are tender and vulnerable? We try to protect them. A year ago, January, I was working out in my garage, and I was doing lunges, and I was pretty impressed with myself because I was in better shape than I've been in a long time. And lunges, you're like, take a big step back, and then you bend your front knee, and then something wasn't right. And at my age, sometimes that happens, and it just goes away or stays. You just don't know. And it stayed, and so for a while, because I couldn't get in the doctor right away, I had a tender, vulnerable knee, and so I favored it and limped around for a little bit. And then if you do that too much, then your hip starts to hurt and it all goes bad. So eventually I got to the doctor and found out that I had torn my meniscus, and we scheduled surgery, but the scheduled surgery was pretty far out. And so I had to spend a good bit of time protecting my tender and vulnerable knee. May 1st, I had surgery. A week later, I was at the doctor. It was a minor tear. He said it was all good. He said, you probably don't need to do physical therapy. You can if you want. Just for the next 6 weeks, protect your knee. Don't go up and down any ladders, which I did do a little bit because we were remodeling our kitchen. Don't do a lot of stairs. So I spent 6 weeks doing that, and then he said, you can more or less return to normal activity. So I had a tender, vulnerable knee, and I did the best I could to protect it. In the Christmas story, Mary and Jesus isn't the only tender, vulnerable thing. At the very end of the Christmas story that we read each year, we hear that the shepherds have come and shared this great news of the angel's visit, and it says that Mary treasured these words and pondered them in her heart. If you think about that, the fact that she treasured something and pondered it, right, that means she was holding it close, just like we do with things that are tender. And those are the vulnerable spaces. Now, this was not an uncomplicated time for Mary. She wasn't given birth at home where she would have maybe expected to do that, surrounded by her community that would have carried her along, right? She was in somebody else's barn behind their hotel that was too full because the emperor said they had to go someplace. So when we're told that Mary was treasuring these things and pondering them in her heart, it's not simply the joy of a birth, but it's complicated because the empire is there and all of the rest of the things that are happening. Now, it won't be long before, to protect that vulnerable baby Jesus, they have to flee to Egypt as refugees. And then a little bit later, they go up when Jesus is a little kid to Jerusalem. And when they leave to go home, they forget to take Jesus with them because he stays behind. Have you ever lost your kid? That's terrible, right? So they're a couple of days in and they go, oh no, where's Jesus? When I was in seminary intern, we lived in my internship, and most days my wife picked the kids up from the bus stop and on the other end of the apartment complex. But one day I was supposed to pick them up, and then I was in a meeting a little bit late, and then there was a little bit more traffic. So when I got to the apartment, they should have let themselves in, and they weren't there. So I ran all the way down to the other end of the apartment complex, which is across the entrance in a big major road. They weren't there. I came all the way back, and who was I getting ready to call? The police. And then I remembered that the neighbors' kids always walked their dog when they got home, and I didn't see them. So first I called the school. But in that 4 minutes, my stress level went way up and then came way back down when I found out the bus was late, right? So when I look back on that, do I treasure that in my heart? No. Do I ponder it? I did for a while. Wasn't late again, right, to pick them up. So Mary, treasuring and pondering things in her heart, that's what happens after that story. They go back and find Jesus. He gets a little bit of a scolding. And then again, Luke tells us, Mary treasured and pondered these things in her heart. So in this story of Jesus, we find that there are things that Mary carries around with her that are close and tender. And when we gather on Christmas, we all carry things that are close and tender, things that we maybe don't share with other people. They might be disappointed hopes. They might be guilt or shame that we have carried with us for a long time. It might be a relationship that has not been going great, that we would love to see reconciled, and we don't know how to do that, and we don't know how to talk about it. And so we keep all that stuff here. And some of it we can treasure, like the celebrations. But in the world that we live in that can be very messy, even those celebrations are often tied in with the messy stuff of life, so that our treasuring and our pondering and our struggling all kind of sit in this complicated space. Now, there are times where those things that we hold close and tender should be just kept right there, because there aren't safe people or safe places for us to talk about it. But there's other times where it would help if we didn't keep those things so close. After 6 weeks of protecting my knee, it wasn't getting any better. And I eventually went back to the doctor, and then I started physical therapy, because there was two things I was afraid to do: squats and lunges. And so I started physical therapy. First couple sessions, very easy. And then I hit the one where they wanted me to do lunges, right? The very thing that I was most scared to do. So I took a big step back. Did it hurt? Absolutely. Still does. But in starting to do those things that were scary and painful, it actually started to get better. I'm mostly back to normal function at this point, still working at it and still doing those same exercises that are the most challenging. I think that's the way it goes for the things that we hold close, that we treasure and ponder. Sometimes we need to keep them there, but sometimes we need to do the scary thing of reaching out to that person that we need to reconcile with, or offering that forgiveness, or seeking that forgiveness that has been hanging over our heads, or getting counseling, or doing the things we need to do to deal with our mental health. Whatever it is that gets those tender spots to a place where there can be healing. Here's the thing with Mary. She treasures all this and ponders it in her heart, and on Christmas it's easy to stop in that part of the story, because that's why we're here. But eventually, can she protect Jesus forever? Nope. And her pondering and her treasuring gets to places of grief that you cannot imagine. Well, some of you have experienced it, right? But that's that space. Christmas is about God finding us and joining us in those tender spaces. The ones that we carry around, the ones that we're afraid to let out, the ones that we venture out into bravely. And the promise of Christmas is that God continues to come and find us in those tender spaces to carry along our treasuring and carry along our pondering and get us to the gift of life that we have in Jesus. That's the Easter story, the death and resurrection. At Christmas, we just sit in that treasuring and pondering of the tender spaces, trusting that God shows up in them with us. Amen.